Good day. Today we will deal with the subject of nerves, muscle receptors, and the basic spinal reflexes. What we would like to achieve today is, first, to familiarize ourselves with the specific nomenclature, primarily focus on the naming of the different nerve types. Then we will explain the concept of reflex. Once we understand this, we will review the more common spinal reflexes in the organism. We will touch on how the signals are conveyed for the purpose of locomotion and posture. And finally, we will conclude the session explaining the difference between upper and lower motor neuron disease. In order to understand what we are referring to, we always have to follow some type of conventional nomenclature. The descriptions of nerves does not follow a single nomenclature, but unfortunately there are two conventions to name nerves. The original nomenclature described by Erlanger and Geiser in 1941 involved the use of Latin letters and used A for fully myelinated axons, B for partially myelinated axons, and C for unmyelinated axons. This designation could include both sensory and motor neurons. The type of axons were further subdivided into A alpha, A beta, A gamma, and A delta in order to describe the decreasing diameters of each of these motor neurons. Once more axons were discovered and their roles were identified as having the opposite effect, a new nomenclature had to be designed. This more modern nomenclature uses 5 types of neurons identified by Roman numerals, followed by a Latin letter, thus generating type 1A, type 1B, type 2, type 3, and type 4 axons. Larger diameter fibers, which really are the axons of the neurons, transmit electricity in a faster manner than those with a smaller diameter. Okay? Letters A implied that they are myelinated axons, the same as numbers 1 to 3. Letter C imply non-myelinated, the same as number 4 in the Roman classification. The change from alpha to delta is correlated with reducing the diameter, which goes correlated with a reduced speed of transmission. In the more modern nomenclature, that with Roman numerals, 1A are the thickest axons, thus the fastest to transmit a signal, much faster and thicker than those 3, which are much smaller diameter, therefore they transmit the signal much slower. Fibers type 4 are not only the smallest diameter, as you can see here, but they are also unmyelinated, therefore the slowest transmitter fibers or axons in the body. I do not expect you to memorize all the fibers' names or the function that they perform according to what is described in here. This is only a reference. Okay? There are, however, a few of these names that you will realize you need to know, as they are associated with some of the reflexes that we're going to see in a little while. Before we get into the reflexes, we have to learn a little bit about some of the structural characteristics of muscles. Here we have a cartoon image of a piece of muscle. Muscles are made of muscle fibers, which are called extrafusal muscle fibers. And they are innervated by alpha motor neurons. Okay? And if you remember the previous slide, these are the largest diameter, therefore fastest transmitting neurons. In between the extrafusal fibers, we have a spindle, which is a proprioceptor, which in reality is a very specialized sensory receptor made out of 10 to 14 specialized muscle fibers, and they are encased in connective tissue, given the shape of a spindle. Okay? These receptors are tapered at both ends. Therefore, it has a fusiform shape. These shapes gives the name to the different muscle fibers. Those that are outside the muscle spindle are called extrafusal fibers, and those 10 to 14 fibers which make the spindle are called intrafusal muscle fibers because they're within the spindle. The fibers within the spindle are innervated by two types of sensory neurons, while the extremes are innervated by gamma motor neurons. The function of these structures will be discussed in detail a little bit later. Let us review the component of a reflex arc. To start, we need a receptors to sense the initial input. In this case, the receptor and the sensory neuron are the same because the free nerve ending of the afferent neuron detects the irritation caused by the offending object and converts this sensation into an action potential, which is carried to the spinal cord. This neuron enters the spinal cord through the dorsal root, and this neuron has the body located in the dorsal root ganglion. Then the axon of this sensory neuron synapses within the spinal cord with an interneuron. Okay? Depending on the type of reflex, this interneuron may or may not be necessary. Subsequently, either the sensory neuron or the interneuron synapse with an alpha motor neuron, which leaves the spinal cord through the ventral root and carries the information to the effector organ, which in turn will carry out the action of removing the leg from the object that causes the pain. If no interneuron is involved, then we have a monosynaptic arc. But if an interneuron participated, then we have a polysynaptic arc reflex. Depending on how much of the spinal cord is used in a reflex, we have two types of reflexes. A segmental reflex, which involves only a short segment of the central nervous system in the spinal cord. For example, if a fly hovers around the horse to eventually stand up on his flank, this is sensed by the hair cells of the skin, and the sensation is transmitted to a sensory afferent neuron which carry the information to the spinal cord. Here we saw that connection in an orange line. The afferent sensory neuron synapses in the spinal cord with an efferent motor neuron carrying the information back to the skin. In the skin, the response is to shake the muscles in order to dislodge the fly. The connection in the spinal cord was very localized. The signal entered through the dorsal aspect of the spinal cord, and the efferent signal left the spinal cord through the ventral nerve of the same vertebra. Therefore, it used only a segment of the central nervous system at the spinal cord. This reflex arc was a monosynaptic reflex because there was only one synapse used in the spinal cord. The second type of reflex are the intersegmental reflexes. These require the involvement of several segments or portions of the central nervous system. Imagine your dependable tack or nail in the floor. When the horse steps on the tack or nail, the pain is sensed by a nerve-ending terminal which carry the information as an axon potential to the spinal cord. The afferent neuron then synapses in the spinal cord with several other interneurons, one of them to stimulate the flexor muscle of the injured leg in order to lift it up. But since the animal is lifting this leg, it has to transfer its weight to the opposite leg. The interneuron synapses with neurons that cross the spinal cord and stimulate the extensor muscle of the opposite leg. There is also synapses to compensate for the weight in the back legs. But because the initial point is related to pain, that information must also be communicated to the brain, which will decide to store it or, if needed, take any additional measure to avoid further damage. As you can see, this more complex response needs to involve more sections or segments of the central nervous system. Therefore, this type of reflex is intersegmental. There are several reflexes which are very common. Some of them are executed multiple times per second, while others are used less often. The stretch or myotatic reflex can be executed as a monosynaptic or polysynaptic event. Its function is to prevent overstretching of a given muscle, and it is an integral mechanism that permits animals to stand without falling sideways. Because of its role, it becomes the most commonly used reflex as it takes place multiple times per second in a completely automatic manner. Another very common reflex is the autogenic inhibition or Golgi tendon reflex, which can be either mono or polysynaptic in nature. Its role is to prevent damage to tendon and muscles. The last of the common reflexes is the withdrawal or flexor reflex. We have already seen part of this reflex, and we know that it's a polysynaptic event. And its function is to remove an appendix or an area from a noxious stimulus. In order to describe the myotactic reflex, we first must further explain the details of the muscle spindle. We know that the muscle spindle is nested within the extrafusal muscle fibers of the muscle. Here we can see that the spindle is supported by tendons at both ends tendons which attach at the point of attachment of the muscle. We can also see that the central part of the spindle is a non-contractile component of the receptor, which is innervated by two sensory neurons, type 1A and type 2. The type 1A sensory fiber tracks the rate or how fast the muscle is stretching. The type 2 sensory fiber detects the amount of stretching taking place. Type 2 fibers are non-adaptative, thus they keep sending action potential with the information of how much it is stretched after the muscle has finished stretching, and it lasts until the stretching is reversed. The ends of the spindles have contractile sections which are innervated by a slightly slower transmitting gamma motor neurons. Now we can move into describing the different types of reflexes. The myotactic or stretch reflex is one of the simplest reflexes which contracts a muscle that is being stretched. This reflex is mediated through a monosynaptic arc which maintains an animal in a steady standing posture and coordinates muscle movement. The sensory receptor consists of several specialized skeletal muscle fibers which makes up a muscle spindle. As we just described before, the spindle is made of intrafusal fibers which are nested within the extrafusal fibers of the muscle. The skeletal muscle cells of the spindle can be divided into two sections with two different physical characteristics. The central part of the spindle, which does not have a contractile capability, and the extremes of the spindle, which can contract. The central section is innervated by sensory neuron which synapse in the spinal cord with A-alpha motor neurons, which in turn synapse with the extrafusal muscle fiber in which the spindle is located. The contractile section of the spindle is innervated by a gamma motor neuron. When the muscle stretches, the spindle detects this pattern through the sensory neurons which carry the action potential to the spinal cord, where it synapses with the alpha motor neuron first. The alpha motor neuron then carries the action potential to the muscle in which the spindle is located and triggers his contractile activity to resist being stretched. The role of the A-gamma motor neuron is to regulate the sensitivity of the muscle spindle as the muscle shortens. They regulate the sensitivity by shortening the muscles of the spindle, thus matching the tension with the muscle. Since the muscle needs to contract first to oppose the stretching, the signal to it is through the alpha motor neuron, which is a bigger diameter, thus is faster, and then the spindle has to adapt. Therefore, its signal comes through a gamma motor neuron, which is slower. The next very common reflex is the autogenic inhibition or Golgi reflex. The autogenic inhibition reflex is to a certain extent the opposite of the myotactic or stretch reflex. Unlike the myotactic reflex, however, the autogenic inhibition reflex, also recognized as the Golgi reflex, is a polysynaptic event. Its purpose is to prevent damage to a muscle that is contracting beyond his physical capability and its respective tendon. When a muscle is contracting in a sustained manner, it's because the A alpha motor neuron connected to the extrafusal fiber of that muscle are continuously sending instruction to the muscle to contract. Most likely, the instructions to these alpha motor neurons are coming from higher center, as this is a purposely done contractile activity. While the muscle is contracting, it becomes shorter, creating tension in the tendons that attach the muscle to the respective bone. The tension in the tendon is sensed by a series of receptors called the Golgi organ or Golgi tendon organ, GTO for shorter, which are type of 1B sensory nerve fibers. If the tension is too large, then the Golgi tendon organ fires and sends an action potential which, as all sensory information, enters the spinal cord through the dorsal root, and in the grain horn it synapses with an inhibitory interneuron, which in turn synapses with the alpha motor neuron that connect to the extrafusal fascicle of that fiber of that muscle. The inhibitory signal prevents the alpha motor neuron from further stimulating the muscle. Therefore, the muscle suddenly relaxes, alleviating the tension in the tendon and preventing potential damage to it and to the muscle. This phenomenon is very commonly seen in weightlifters. The lifting of an abnormally heavy mass can only be done by concentrating in making the muscles that carry out the lift to contract continuously. Thus, the signal is coming from higher centers. But if the weight is too much, then you will see that the athlete suddenly drops the weight. This dropping is usually triggered by the Golgi reflex. You can see towards the end of this clip that the reflex took place involving both knees and the athlete suddenly fell. The last of the common reflexes is the withdrawal reflex, and we should be all familiar with it because it happens very commonly in daily life. When an animal receives suddenly a noxious stimulus in a limb, this is either detected by or transmitted to the dendrites of an afferent sensory bipolar neuron through an action potential, which is then carried out to the central nervous system. The signal enters through the dorsal root into the spinal cord. Here the axon of the afferent neuron synapses with several interneurons. One synapse is with a stimulatory interneuron, which in turn synapses with an afferent A alpha motor neuron, which leaves the spinal cord through the ventral root of a spinal nerve to connect and stimulate the flexor muscle, which is in charge of moving the limb or the part of the body away from the painful stimulus. Simultaneously, and to facilitate the required flexion of the limb, a collateral branch of the sensory axon also synapses with an inhibitory interneuron, which innervates the alpha motor neuron of the corresponding extensor muscle, preventing this neuron from firing, thus avoiding the contraction of the extensor muscle. This is called reciprocal inhibition and permits a fast and smooth withdrawal of the limb from the noxious stimulus. But there is a little bit more to the story. We will review everything again and complete the picture. Upon stepping on the nail as we mentioned before, the sensory afferent brings the noxious information to the spinal cord. This neuron synapses with a stimulatory A-alpha motor neuron connected to the flexor muscle of the injured limb. Simultaneously, and to facilitate the required flexion of the limb, a collateral branch of the sensory axon also synapses with an inhibitory interneuron which innervates the A-alpha motor neuron of the corresponding extensor muscle, preventing this neuron from firing, thus preventing the contraction of the extensor muscle. This connection is called the reciprocal innervation, and the effect is named reciprocal inhibition, and it permits a fast and smooth withdrawal of the limb from the noxious stimulus. Also associated with the withdrawal reflex is the crossed extensor reflex. This reflex involves interneuron in charge of stimulating the A-alpha motor neuron, which stimulate the withdrawal of the limb, having collateral axons that cross the spinal cord and stimulate the extensor muscle in the opposite side, while inhibiting the flexor muscles of the opposite side. This permits switching the load to the unaffected limb in order to prevent a potential fall. To ensure full stability, the interneuron is also synapsed to neurons in the hind limb, ensuring that the extensor muscles are activated and the flexors are inhibited. Now that we have discussed the reflexes, let's move to our fourth learning objective, which deals with the basic aspects of posture and locomotion. Some of the movements an animal performs are voluntary, while the large majority of them are involuntary. Looking at the voluntary movement, we realize that to happen, the animal has to be aware. These movements can be perfected through practice or exercise. They involve the flexor and the extensor muscles. For example, when the signal goes to a limb to move, the signal goes to the flexor to lift up the limb, and at the same time the extensor is inhibited. But when that limb is getting down, the extensor is activated and the flexor is inhibited. The neurons used for voluntary movement are located on what anatomically is described as the pyramidal system. And the pyramidal system is made out of two different nerve tracts. The corticospinal tract, which goes from the cerebral cortex down through the spinal cord to innervate muscles in both the limb and the torso. So basically, the corticospinal tract covers the majority of the body. The other tract is the corticobulbar tract, which carries signal from the cerebral cortex to neurons that reach in the brainstem, in the midbrains, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, from where they innervate different aspects of the face and neck. Although these neurons have their location, their body located within the central nervous system, they are considered lower motor neuron, as we're going to see in the next topic. The involuntary movements are responsible for maintaining posture and equilibrium. They occur constantly, and the animal does not have any idea that they are taking place. They involve extensor or anti-gravity muscles, as we discussed under the stretch reflex. And they are executed through neurons in what anatomically is described as the extrapyramidal system. The extrapyramidal system carries from the cerebral cortex, in conjunction with the cerebellum, the information to carry out all the involuntary movements. These movements are all fine-tuned by the cerebellum. And we're going to see the action of the cerebellum in our fifth topic. The last topic we have to cover today deals with motor neuron disease, which relate to damage to motor neurons in different areas of the nervous system. Motor neuron disease is divided into upper and lower motor neuron disease. Upper motor neuron disease involves damage to the central nervous system. So if damage occurs to the brain, for example, the animal will manifest very inappropriate movements. They will translate in some type of seizure. The animal may perform circling patterns. They will not know how to place the limbs, or they simply can show some rigidity. Now, if damage occurs somewhere in the spinal cord, the areas distal or caudal to the damage will show some type of paralysis. In all cases, the muscle mass of the animal will be retained, so there is no atrophy in response to upper motor neuron disease, and that's one of the clinical signs that this is upper motor neuron disease. The segmental reflexes are also be retained because the reflex arc elements will not be damaged if damage has happened to the central nervous system. The complement to upper motor neuron disease is lower motor neuron disease. Using our trustful horse with the peripheral nervous system in here, we can see that if we impair the transmission in any of the pathways of the peripheral nervous system, we have a case of lower motor disease. Lower motor disease is characterized for some type of paralysis, and as you can deduce, if there is some kind of interruption in the transmission of an action potential, the intended signal will not reach the effector organ or muscle, and there will be no contractile activity or response. The clear evidence that there is a lower motor disease is that due to the absence of motor activity, the muscles will undergo atrophy. The other observation will be the lack of segmental or intersegmental reflexes, because if the alpha motor neuron is damaged, there will be not a reflex arc. The lack of reflex can also be due to damage in the sensory pathway. Usually, if the problem is due to trauma, most likely both afferent and efferent nerves will be affected. This completes the material that we intended to cover today. Hope it was useful. Just to remind you what we have done today, we cover the current methodology to name nerve fibers. Then we define a reflex arc and explain the three most common reflexes in some detail. We follow with the basic explanation on how signals are transmitted to maintain posture and to control locomotion. And we concluded by describing the basis of upper and lower motor disease. I hope you have a good rest of the day. Goodbye. Have a good day.